Ladies and gentlemen, would you please warmly welcome our chief guest, His Grace Archbishop Peter Loy Chong, to the stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, first I'd like to acknowledge my gratitude to the party president. Who's the president?
I think that's me.
Pio Chikundundu, and Biman is the party leader. Biman, to say a few words to you or give you a keynote address on this very important meeting of the National Federation Party. Thank you very much. As you know, on the 10th of October, Fiji, we celebrate our 50th independence anniversary. Independence from British colonial rule and its particular form of power that has been labeled by some, including myself, as the patron-client politics, the form of power that also flowed into the independence era and till to today. However, today, as writers have said, we are faced with a new form of colonialism or neo-colonialism, and that is globalization. Globalization is the new form of political domination. In doing my studies, I did a lot of reading to understand colonialism, did a lot of reading in Africa where a lot of colonialism took place. One of the phrases that African writers quote is that we have become independent, but not democratic. And therefore, any political party or government hoping to bring about integral political and economic development must address the power of globalization today to bring about a true democratic society. So what is globalization? Globalization is a complex issue that can be defined in many ways depending on the discipline that you want to define globalization. One author, his name is John Nedavin, says globalization is being shaped by technological changes, involves configuration of states, extends regionalism, and is uneven. Another commonly recognized consequence of globalization is that it produces time-space compression and more intensive interactions across wider space and in shorter time than before. The thread that runs through the globalization discourses refers to globalization as the increasing connectivity. The boom of information and communication technologies forms part of the infrastructure of globalization in finance, capital mobility, and export-oriented business activity, transnational communications, migration, travel, and civil society interactions. The world, as they say, has become intensely interconnected, and in its actions that it is difficult to set boundaries between territories. Increasingly, what happens economically and politically and socially in a country will significantly influence other countries and their citizens, as we see with COVID-19. With this worldwide movement, the boundaries that define local have been broken. In a globalizing world, we see more interconnectedness, where boundaries are erased and homogeneous culture is created. People, money, and products move around the world with ease and intensity and at a high velocity, bringing dramatic cultural changes. Many writers on globalization declare that the world has shrunk into a highly interconnected global village. Another way of defining globalization is in terms of culture. Globalization brings about a culture based on the market. It focuses on making profit at the expense of human beings and creation. It privileges the power of multinational corporations, which have now dominion over the world in terms of exploitation and production, markets, and political and economic policies. It is their power and influence that have caused the intensity, the extensity, the velocity of so many things to increase as they moved and used around the world. Multinational corporations, as they say, rule the world today. Well, COVID is a little bit playing its own game in there. So there's a Indian theologian, Michael Amalador, says, the market seizes on whatever opportunity there is to make profit and thereby reducing human beings to mere means of production and commodity. Globalization promotes a culture that serves the interests of corporations and the rich and continues to make the poor even poorer. So where did this globalization come from? And so I'd like to just give a very brief, it's good to go understand where it comes from. Several factors contributed to the high development in technology, communication, and transportation that have brought about this phenomenon that we call globalization. Globalization can be seen as emerging from the economic crisis after the Second World War. And faced with the depression resulting from the Second World War, the economic powers tried to create a way forward in terms of economic development. And so in July 1944, the world's leading economic players, economists, politicians, bankers, and prominent representatives of corporations met in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire to map out the future of economic development. They concluded that to avoid another worldwide depression, a global corporation would need to be formed, and new bureaucracies and new rules of free trade would have to be designed to support this. This Bretton Woods meeting gave birth to globalization and the institutions that would become instrumental to promoting its vision, particularly the World Bank, at that time called the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and the International Monetary Fund and others. Globalization engineered a vision of economic development that has brought about a rapid shift in the world, a reordering marked by fast communication, transport, and high technology. Today, the World Bank and IMF and ADB are the superpowers controlling economics, politics throughout the world. They have taken over the sovereign authority states have traditionally held over their domains by breaking national, cultural, geographical boundaries, directing the world toward becoming a single, homogeneous society, a global village. In fact, many governments are forced to serve the multinational corporations rather than the people that elected them. Globalization brings about economic development that by design serves corporations and their accumulation of capital. It measures economic development in terms of profits and monetary wealth and argues that this will alleviate poverty. When corporations rule the world, a book written by David Cotton, illustrates this well. He sees globalization as an attempt to integrate the world's mega corporations into a single borderless global economy in which the world's mega corporations are free to move goods and money anywhere in the world that affords an opportunity for profit without governmental interference. In the name of increased efficiency, the alliance seeks to privatize public services. Globalization robs nations of their resources through free trade and also robbing families and local indigenous communities of their livelihood. I've just returned from a vote tour in Ba last week to do a prayer service by the river. And this is one typical example of how a local village that depends on the river and the sea for sustenance have been deprived of that because we have allowed a company to extract sand from the seashore of Votua. As one woman said, all this that's in this village came from the river and the sea, not much from the land. They are a seashore economy village. To accomplish their vision, Bretton Woods institutions rely solely on a strategy based on economic development. For them, development is equal to economic development. And economic growth depends on investment. So poor countries like Fiji, who have little to invest, foreign borrowing seems to be their only hope of development. Globalization proponents argue that with more foreign borrowing, there will be rapid growth and faster development. The market is the root metaphor for this economic system. And the development paradigm of this institution is more profits equals economic development. To facilitate economic growth, their policies support a development of a new economic system that had full and free control over resources, production, and trade. And therefore, resources have to be freed up. Freedoms in market and trade have to be guaranteed by nations. However, countries that need development have to adjust to this criteria and accommodate foreign investors as much as possible. And this means deregulation, eliminating laws that would in any way hinder the economic activities of corporations. Very little consultation. That's what I hear in Votua. Only a handful of chiefs were probably taken to one bar somewhere, and then when they are half drunk and the deal is made. But to the many village people, especially the women, they were not part of the discussion. Unfortunately, in many cases, this means relaxing laws that protect human dignity, nature, environment. We are big on this. We chair the COP23, but we neglect our backyard. Corporations demand total freedom for their economic activities, so much so that they displace the government in terms of decision-making, setting policies for development. They become the sovereign power and decision-maker. Corporations and supporters of foreign investments have always argued, in the end, profits will be shared with governments and communities and help alleviate poverty. However, this argument has not always been true. I was talking to the people in Votua. They said, how much money have you got from this thing? They said, well, actually, not yet. But we've been promised that by the company that out of the 3% that goes to the government, we will get 85%. So in PNG, they talk about fair share. So where is the fair share? Namosi Joint Venture visited me, and I asked them the same question. How much do the landowners get from your profit? They say they did not answer that question. They said the government will get 5%, and that 5%, out of that 5%, they decide how much they give to Namosi. So I told the Namosi people a few years ago, you are better off not doing any mining there. Now, what are the features of globalization? There are many features, but I just like to focus on one, and that is because of the limited time, and that is on the governance of the nation state. There are many features that comes with globalization, the commodifying of resources and all that. But I think for today's purpose, it's good to talk about the nation state. A characteristic of globalization in Fiji is the power of multinational corporations over the government. Corporations are powerful and do not recognize any border. That's what's happening here. As these are two authors of globalization, Held and McGrew, write, multinational corporation defines a borderless economy in which the power of governments to manage the national economy is being eroded. And this is especially true for third world countries like Fiji that do not have the resources to stand autonomously in terms of economic development. They become easy victims of the domination of multinational corporations. Local governments are often advised by the Bretton Woods institution, IMF and WB. They need to abide by the institution's structural adjustment program. Local governments are not to allow for free activity, of corporations, free up resources for exploitation, And this makes local governments servants of the multinationals rather than the people that they are called to serve. And this is obvious on how Fiji governments have given in to the superpowers of multinational corporations. Export-oriented, back I think in the 1980s, tax-free industry was a big thing to boost up the economy. Well, that's part of the whole globalization phase. 95% export. So what does that mean? They come and do their business here without paying in tax, but a lot of the products they use here is exported overseas, and for the benefit of some people overseas, we don't benefit what it was made in Fiji. Somebody else is benefiting over that side. And that is why the African saying is true. We have become independent, but not democratic. Are we really independent from foreign nations, foreign control? I think we can answer that for ourselves. So nations have not disappeared. Fiji is still here. The blue banner is still flying, but they now operate within a different context. Multinational corporations rule. States retain power, but we have to yield to the power in collaboration, yield our power in collaboration with other nations and non-state actors. So that's a little bit of the new colonialism that we face today. And what's our way out of this, or what's the way forward? How do we humanize globalization? I'd just like to say a few words from the Catholic social teaching. Two principles of Catholic social teaching help me as a Catholic to talk about globalization, and one is participation. Pope Paul VI said, participation and equality are fundamental aspirations that are two forms of human dignity and freedom. Pope Paul says There is a basic drive in human beings to seek, as they seek greater development, to share the responsibility in decision-making that shape their individual and collective future. And he says that globalization suffers a democratic deficit. Globalization has two fault lines in decision-making. One, local communities do not get an adequate hearing, and decisions about trade, foreign debt, and capital investments are made with little or no input from the majority of people. And that's what's happening in some of our villages, in Votua, in Dausamu, other places where the local people are not even heard, or the majority, probably only a few handful are heard. The number two fault line is the divide between the elite and local communities. And even entire states lack true participation in the decision-making of the economics. The number two principle is subsidiarity. Subsidiarity calls for keeping capacities to assessors decide and act at the most local level as possible, while still being effective in securing the common good. And so what we are saying is we want things on the local. We don't, as somebody said, we don't want a big nanny government, like a big mother hen keeping us all under the wings of the mother chicken, depriving us of freedom. In globalization, nation states have not disappeared. They only operate in a different context. And while they retain power, they have to wield into the power of the corporations. So what is needed? There is a need for true political authority, new forms of governance and political authority, creation of new institutions and practices for managing a new world. Or as a Protestant, well-known Old Testament scholar said, we need another kingdom, not the kingdom of globalization. So globalization must be regulated and directed. For the Catholic social teaching, it asks some fundamental questions when it comes to economic or political development. Number one, what does it do for people? Number two, what does it do to people? A little bit different. And number three is, how do people participate in that decision making? Who rules, in whose name, and by what means, and for what goals are vital for the future of the government. So our popes, beginning from John Paul VI, John Paul II, the late Pope Benedict, all are calling for a new form of governance and political authority, a new world order. And what is needed is a new political globalization that matches, counters, and humanizes economic globalization. What is required is an openness to new institutions and procedures. Dear friends, I'm speaking here as a leader of a church. It is not the church's role to replace you from this arena. This is your divine calling as politicians and economists. Neither is the church's role to make policies and to tell you how to do things. We are not a specialist in that area. But the church seeks to inspire the state and politicians, in particular, political institutions, with the beauty and the goodness of our divine truth, and for us, it's the Catholic social teaching, in order to bring about a new, more just society. Our social doctrine of the Catholic Church has two purposes. One, to set forth the requirements of just social action set forth in the Bible and Catholic social teaching. And number two is to denounce social, economic, political actions and structures in the name of justice and the kingdom of God. The church wants to build a just society. And we just farewell one Father Ba, who is a big prophet along these lines. And finally, I think with globalization today, we have to bring in COVID-19, which is, some people are saying, has COVID-19 slowed down globalization or tamed globalization? As we read, I think in many ways it is doing that. But it gives us a time, as Pope Francis says, to look back and to rethink and reset the world. And finally, dear friends, I'd like to, before I end, I was at a retreat center in San Francisco, run by the Franciscans. It's a quiet, you're supposed to not talk in these retreats. It's a silent retreat. But in one morning, I was sharing a table with an Indian man in the breakfast, and I was tempted to talk to him. So I asked him, what's your work? I'm a political campaigner. If somebody wants to run for politics, I run his campaign. Oh, that's a very interesting work. And then he said the story that a member of his church, his parish, wanted to run for the governor of that state, and asked him if he could run his campaign. And so he said, okay, before I say yes or no, let me ask you one question. Are you ready to lie? And he said, and the other, his friend laughed, and I said, why? Well, this game is about lying, eh? The party president and party leader, members of the NFP, I congratulate the National Federation Party for reaching a milestone of 50th anniversary. You are the oldest party in the Pacific. That's what Biman told me. And this is a testimony to a well-established vision and unity within your party. And congratulations. I wish you well as you enter into the context of politics marked by globalization and the impacts of COVID-19, and may God bless you.